The system has played a trick on today's would-be revolutionaries and rebels. The trick is so cute that if it had been consciously planned, one would have to admire it for its almost mathematical elegance. The system is not George W. Bush and his advisors and appointees. It is not the cops who maltreat protesters. It is not the CEOs of the multinational corporations, and it is not the Frankensteins in their laboratories who criminally tinker with the genes of all living things. All of these people are servants of the system, but in themselves they do not constitute the system. In particular, the personal individual values, attitudes, beliefs, and behavior of any of these people may be significantly in conflict with the needs of the system. To illustrate with an example, the system requires a respect for property rights, yet CEOs, cops, scientists, and politicians sometimes steal. And speaking of stealing, we don't have to confine ourselves to actual lifting of physical objects. We can include all illegal means of acquiring property, such as cheating on income tax, accepting bribes, and any other form of gift or corruption. But the fact that CEOs, cops, scientists, and politicians sometimes steal does not mean that stealing is part of the system. On the contrary, when a cop or politician steals something, he is rebelling against the system's requirement for the respect of law and private property. Yet even when they are stealing, these people remain servants of the system as long as they publicly maintain their support for law and property. Whatever illegal acts may be committed by politicians, cops, or CEOs as individuals, theft, bribery, and graft are not part of the system, but diseases of the system. The less stealing there is, the better the system functions. And that is why servants and boasters of the system always advocate obedience to the law in public, even if they may sometimes find it convenient to break the law in private. Take another example. Although the police are the system's enforcers, police brutality is not part of the system. When the cops beat the crap out of a suspect, they are not doing the system's work. They are only letting out their own anger and hostility. The system's goal is not brutality or the expression of anger. As far as police work is concerned, the system's goal is to compel obedience to the rules and to do so with the least possible amount of disruption, violence, and bad publicity. Thus, from the system's point of view, the ideal cop is one who never gets angry, never uses more violence than necessary, and as far as possible relies on manipulation rather than force to keep people under control. Police brutality is only another disease of the system, not part of the system. For proof, look at the attitude of the media. The mainstream media almost universally condemn police brutality. Of course, the attitude of the mainstream media represents, as a rule, the consensus of opinion among the most powerful classes in our society as to what is good for the system. What has just been said about theft, graft, and police brutality applies also to issues of discrimination and victimization such as racism, sexism, homophobia, poverty, and sweatshops. All of these are bad for the system. For example, the more black people that feel themselves scorned or excluded, the more likely they are to turn to crime and less likely they are to educate themselves for careers that will make them useful to the system. Modern technology, with its rapid long-distance transportation and distribution of traditional ways of life, has led to a mixing of populations so that nowadays people of different races, nationalities, cultures, and religions have to live and work side by side. If people hate or reject one another on the basis of race, ethnicity, sexual preference, etc., the resulting conflicts interfere with the functioning of the system. The leaders of the system know this very well, and that is why we are taught in school and through the media to believe that racism, sexism, homophobia, and so forth are social evils to be eliminated. That is why the system, not withstanding any private deviations by individual members of the elite, is basically committed to suppressing discrimination and victimization. For proof, look again at the attitude of the mainstream media. In spite of occasional timid dissent by a few of the more daring reactionary commenters, media propaganda overwhelmingly favors racial and gender equality and acceptance of homosexuality and interracial marriage. As a result of the servitude, the powerlessness, and the other indignities that the system inflicts on us, there is widespread frustration which leads to an impulse to rebel. And this is where the system plays its neatest trick. Through a sleight of hand, it turns rebellion to its own advantage. Many people do not understand the roots of their own frustration, hence their rebellion is directionless. They know that they want to rebel, but they do not know what they want to rebel against. Luckily, the system is able to fill their need by providing with them a list of standard and stereotyped grievances in the name of which to rebel: racism, homophobia, women's issues, poverty, sweatshops, the whole laundry bag of activists' issues. Huge numbers of would-be rebels take the bait in fighting racism, sexism, etc., etc. They are only doing the system's work for it. In spite of this, they imagine that they are rebelling against the system. There are still significant numbers of people, as I pointed out earlier, who resist social changes that the system requires, and some of these people are authority figures such as cops, judges, or politicians. These resistors provide a target for the would-be rebels, someone for them to rebel against. Commenters like Rush Limbaugh help the process by ranting against the activists. Seeing that they have made someone angry fosters the activist illusion that they are rebelling. In order to bring themselves into conflict, even with the majority of the system's leaders who fully accept the social changes that the system demands, the would-be rebels insist on solutions that go farther than what the system's leaders consider prudent, and they show exaggerated anger over trivial matters. For example, they demand payment of reparations to black people, and they often become enraged at any criticism of a minority group, no matter how cautious and reasonable. In this way, activists are able to maintain the illusion that they are rebelling against the system, but the illusion is absurd. Agitation against racism, sexism, homophobia, and the like no more constitutes rebellion against the system than does agitation against political graft and corruption. Those who work against graft and corruption are not rebelling but acting as the system's enforcers. They are helping to keep the politicians obedient to the rules of the system. Those who work against racism, sexism, and homophobia similarly act as the system's enforcer. They help the system to suppress the deviant, racist, sexist, and homophobic attitudes that cause problems for the system. But the activists don't act only as the system's enforcers. They also serve as kind of a lightning rod that protects the system by drawing public resentment away from the system and its institutions. For example, there were several reasons why it was the system's advantage to get women out of the home and into the workplace. 50 years ago, if the system, as represented by the government or the media, had began out of the blue a propaganda campaign designed to make it socially acceptable for women to center their lives on careers rather than on the home, the natural human resistance to change would have caused widespread public resentment. What actually happened was that the changes were spearheaded by radical feminists, behind whom the system's institutions trailed at a safe distance. The resentment of the more conservative members of society was directed primarily against the radical feminists rather than the systems and institutions, because the changes sponsored by the system seemed slow and moderate in comparison with the more radical solutions advocated by feminists. And even these relatively slow changes were seen as having been forced on the system by pressure from the radicals. So in a nutshell, the system's neatest trick is this. 1. For the sake of its own efficiency and security, the system needs to bring deep and radical social change to match the change conditions resulting from technological process. 2. The frustration of life under the circumstances imposed by the system leads to rebellious impulses. 3. Rebellious impulses are co-opted by the system in the service of the social change it requires. Activists rebel against the old and outmoded values that are no longer of use to the system, and in favor of the new values that the system needs us to accept. 4. In this way, rebellious impulses, which otherwise might have been dangerous to the system, are given an outlet that is not only harmless to the system, but useful to it. 5. Much of the public resentment resulting from the imposition of social changes is drawn away from the system and its institutions and is directed instead at the radicals who spearhead the social changes. Through this type of process, rebel movements that are dangerous to the system are subjected to negative propaganda, while movements that are believed to be useful to the system are given cautious encouragement in the media. Unconscious absorption of media propaganda influences would-be rebels to rebel in the ways that serve the interests of the system. The university intellectuals also play an important role in carrying out the system's trick. Though they like to fancy themselves independent thinkers, the intellectuals are the most over-socialized, the most conformist, the tamest, and most domesticated, the most pampered and spineless group in America today. As a result, their impulse to rebel is particularly strong. But because they are incapable of independent thought, real rebellion is impossible for them. Consequently, they are suckers for the system's trick, which allows them to irritate people and enjoy the illusion of rebelling without ever having to challenge the system's basic values. Because they are teachers of young people, the university intellectuals are in a position to help the system play its trick on the young, which they do by steering young people's rebellious impulses towards the standard stereotyped targets, racism, colonialism, women's issues, etc. Young people who are not college students learn through the media or through personal contact of the social justice issues for which students rebel, and they imitate the students. Thus, a youth culture develops in which there is a stereotyped mode of rebellion that spreads through imitation of peers, just as hairstyles, clothing styles, and other fads spread through imitation. The fact that the system's trick does not backfire here and there does not prevent it from being, on the whole, a remarkably effective device for turning rebellious impulses to the system's advantage.